How far do Kamala Harris and Donald Trump differ on policy? A short guide to their plans for America, which are more similar than their opposing styles suggest. When it comes to style, the contrast between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump could hardly be starker. She is a former prosecutor from Berkeley, California, who is campaigning on a platform of steady responsibility. He is a property tycoon and frequent defendant from Queens, New York, prone to bizarre rants at rallies. But consider their policies, as The Economist did in a recent series of articles, and the two candidates look more similar. Mr. Trump's approach to topics including trade, China and immigration have set the terms of this contest. How will America's next president act in the areas where he or she, rather than Congress, which may well be divided, has control? Immigration. In 2016, Mr. Trump called for building the wall on America's border with Mexico. He has since moved further to the right. J.D. Vance, his running mate, claims that a mass deportation scheme could start by removing 1M people living in the country illegally. President Trump could slow visa applications by charging higher fees and increasing vetting requirements. Ms. Harris's immigration policy, meanwhile, would largely continue that of President Joe Biden. He opened new legal routes for migrants but restricted the number of asylum claims allowed at the southern border. Mr. Trump's focus on border security has forced Ms. Harris to tack to the right. She says she would make Mr. Biden's limits on asylum harder to lift. She also wants to revive a bipartisan border security bill that failed earlier this year after Mr. Trump criticized it. Tax. At the end of 2025, the tax cuts Mr. Trump introduced in 2017 will expire. Whoever is president must pass new rules or income tax will rise sharply for most. Mr. Trump wants to keep many of his cuts in place. He wants to reduce the corporate tax rate, which he cut from 35% to 21% further, perhaps to 15%. Mr. Trump's tax plan could cost as much as $10 trillion over the next decade. Ms. Harris, meanwhile, hopes to use tax changes to reduce inequality. She has vowed to extend Mr. Trump's expiring tax cuts for people earning less than $400,000 per year. She wants to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%. Most controversially, she would tax the unrealized capital gains of the wealthiest Americans. She would also cut some taxes, largely through targeted credits. Her proposals would generate nearly $2 trillion in federal revenue over the next decade. But independent estimates suggest the higher taxes, especially the increased corporate levy, would weigh on growth. Energy. The next president will inherit the most ambitious climate policies in American history. Left-wingers hope that Ms. Harris would go further. But it seems that she would embrace both clean energy and fossil fuels. She supports domestic oil and gas production, fracking and other green bugbears, such as nuclear power. Conservatives, meanwhile, are confident that Mr. Trump would reverse green policies. His energy mantra is, drill, baby, drill. He has mocked climate science and electric vehicles, EVs. Yet he would be unlikely to scrap Mr. Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, through which the current president enshrined many of his climate policies in law. The most likely change would be to the act's tax breaks. Yet most of these look safe. Nearly 80% are flowing to Republican districts. A Trump victory would not mean a collapse in climate efforts. Trade. Today, America's trade debate revolves around how much the country should close itself off. Mr. Trump has a vision for tariffs that would turn the clock back nearly a century on economic strategy. He has claimed he would slap a tariff of 20% on all imports to America. His fiercest attacks are focused on China. He has threatened tariffs of up to 60% on the country's goods. Kamala Harris is less extreme but still sees a world in which America is best served by soft protectionism. She is calling for subsidies to build up the country's manufacturing muscle and has also signaled her willingness to take punitive trade action against China. Defense spending. Mr. Trump and Ms. Harris have both issued vague commitments to strengthen America's armed forces. Those forces do not seem ready for today's challenges, maintaining deterrence in the Middle East, supporting Ukraine in an attritional conflict, adapting to new forms of warfare and keeping pace with China's rapid military buildup. The main question facing the next president will be how much to increase spending. Republican hawks and the national security establishment want a massive increase. Many Democrats oppose such measures, but agree that Mr. Biden has not been aggressive enough on defense spending. The question facing a Trump presidency would be whether to embrace a spending rate of 5% of GDP, up from the current rate of 3%, or to replicate the more modest increases of his first term. Ms. Harris would have to decide whether to maintain Mr. Biden's policy of after-inflation spending reductions. Her preferences are hard to predict. Middle East. The next president will almost certainly inherit the multi-front conflict between Israel and Iran's axis of resistance. Ms. Harris would probably HEW to Mr. Biden's awkward policy, support Israel's right to defend itself, try to restrain its most dangerous actions, mitigate the humanitarian impact, seek ceasefires, and keep alive the idea of Palestinian statehood. Compared with Mr. Biden, Ms. Harris has more forcefully expressed concern for Palestinian suffering. Mr. Trump, meanwhile, suggests that Israel should be given carte blanche. But neither candidate has shown a desire to use American forces to bomb Iran. When he was president, Mr. Trump abandoned a nuclear deal with Iran, imposed maximum pressure through sanctions, and in 2020 ordered the killing in Iraq of Qasem Soleimani, Iran's head of foreign military operations, but held back from striking the country. As for Palestinians, he cares little for their cause. China. A hardline stance towards China is firmly bipartisan. Neither candidate would ease Mr. Biden's export controls on sensitive goods such as advanced semiconductors. Ms. Harris might make technocratic adjustments to the Biden administration's approach, which is supposed to ensure American military supremacy as well as command of the technologies of the future, including artificial intelligence and quantum computing. She would probably stick to the current China policy slogan, de-risking, not decoupling. A Trump administration could be quite different. One of Mr. Trump's former national security advisors, Robert O'Brien, has written that America should decouple from China. He is one of several superhawks in Republican circles. Whether Mr. Trump will listen to them or choose a more transactional approach with China's leader, Xi Jinping, of whom he has spoken admiringly, is a different matter. Ukraine. The approach to Ukraine is where the gap between the two candidates seems widest. Ms. Harris has been vice president in an administration that has led the Western effort to help Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression. She would continue to supply arms and cash, as long as Congress lets her do so. Mr. Trump's policy is extraordinarily vague. He claims that the war would not have broken out on his watch and that he would end it swiftly. But he does not say how, and his refusal to say which side he would like to win adds to fears that he would urge Ukraine to settle on Russia's terms. Such a catastrophic betrayal is not certain, however. Mr. Trump may worry that letting Russian tanks roll over more of Ukraine would make him look weak.